Hey, what is going on, YouTube? It's Ed here with another episode of Thinking Out Loud. And today we are going to be talking about the newest show on Peacock.com, which is owned by NBC, the streaming service. It's Bel-Air, which is the reboot slash remake reimagining of Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. It is produced, or at least funded, by Will Smith. He's doing a lot of promotions on it on his Instagram and I guess all of his social media. And so I'm going to give you my first kind of take on the first three episodes of this series. So um, I would say it's okay. To sum it all up, I would kind of first really say it's okay. Like one of the biggest issues I feel like with a lot of these um, remakes and reimaginings is that I can't help but compare this show to the original sitcom. Obviously, this is not a sitcom. It's more of like a gritty realization of what is actually going on with Will, and like kind of it's just all completely done in a more, I guess, realistic setting and not a sitcom where you just have an audience laughing and people just doing jokes all day. So it's a lot more gritty. It's supposed to be a lot more realistic in a lot of sense, right? But I can't help but just compare all the characters to the original. Like when they introduce Jazz, when they introduce Hillary, Carlton, Philip, and on Viv, like all I care is like I'm like, oh, is the new Uncle Phil the same as old Uncle Phil, or is it a little different? Like how is Hillary different? And I just can't help but compare, which is like I feel like that's kind of the main like downfall, which is I think why it's getting so much hate on the internet. Like a lot of people are just like, why are you doing this? Like this does not need to happen. Just go watch the old one. And I would say that, like I get it. Like I love the old one. It's one of my favorite shows. It's my the favorite show of all time. And even like I said now, like I can't help but compare the two. But at the same time, I'm trying to approach this whole show like it's completely new, because in a lot of ways it is new in the sense that this is not a sitcom like I said before. I'm trying to approach this as if this is a completely new show, but it's just really hard to do when you can't help but think about the old one, right? So I would say overall, like I'm pretty still, like after watching the first three episodes, I'm pretty interested. Like it's not bad. Like it's not the worst thing I've seen, but it's not the best. But it's still setting up a lot of the story. And so far the story, they are following a bit of the original story, because at the end of the day it is based off of someone's actual life. Obviously in the original sitcom, they threw in a lot of their own stories, and I don't know how much of it was actually based off of Benny Medina's life, which is the old show. I mean, I think it was loosely based. I'm not sure if this is going to be like strictly based off of his life, but there is a lot that goes into it, that there is a parallel, right? They show how Will got in trouble, though they added a lot more to it. In the old one, he just got into a fight, and so his mom was just like, "You need to straight up, so you need to go, across the country." In this one, Will gets caught with a gun, and Uncle Phil basically pulls a lot of strings to get him not get essentially prosecuted, because Will is an honor student. He's an star athlete, which is a little different from what the old one is too, because he wasn't a great student. He was a good athlete, but he wasn't a great student, per se. Um, and so he is moving across the country, in order to basically not get killed, because he pulls a gun on a drug dealer. So instead of just hoodlums, the new, I guess, antagonist, you can say, is actually a pretty dangerous person. And so he moves across the country, and now he goes lives with the Banks family, and the Banks family is a lot more dynamic to it, where, well, I mean, Uncle Phil, instead of just being a lawyer, he is a lawyer, but he's also running for district attorney. So it's where I think is associate DA of Bel-Air or LA. So which is that's a pretty big deal. And so he has now, so they're already going into his political career already, whereas in the show, I mean, he runs to be a judge, and that was his political kind of run, but now it's more about being a district attorney. So off the bat, you start, there's a lot more depth into his character, where he has to basically juggle his home life plus a political career, plus now he has this nephew who just came from the hood, right? So, and there is like a little bit of foreshadowing of how that could affect his political career, because it's like, oh, like, the last thing you want in the political run is like, oh, you have a relative who was about to be a convicted felon, or at least like, well, not a convicted felon, but like to be charged as a felon, and then you pulled all these strings to get him out of it, which is like, arguably like some privilege, right? So that there might be some political backlash because of that. So they could throw into that right away. Aunt Viv is probably the only character that they try to give a lot of screen time to, but there's not a whole lot of intricacies with her yet. Um, so we'll see where that goes later in the series. Hillary has definitely do a complete 180. She's no longer just like the fashion obsessed ditz that she was in the show. Like, this Hillary is actually pretty um I mean, she's still fashion obsessed, but in a very, but she's a lot more focused and driven. In this case, like they're trying to bring it into the 21st century or 2022. She's like a social influencer. She does, her main thing is now cooking, which the old Hillary did not do at all. Like, the old Hillary couldn't, um, almost burned down, or not burned down the house, but like she didn't even know how to make popcorn like in the old show. So now she's like this aspiring cook who does a lot of home recipes, and so she's trying to like break out and be a new type of just social cook influencer type person. So I kind of like that, like this Hillary is not just like kind of like a blonde ditz, so to say, not, to use that kind of reference. um Next, the new Carlton is interesting. Interesting, like played by, was it Ali Sholotan? He does it. I think he does a definitely more interesting job, because like in the old show, played by the great Alfonso Ribeiro, who, classic. He's a hilarious dude. And so New Carlton is now more about, he actually is like a pretty big deal at Bel-Air Academy. He's also like a pretty star athlete playing lacrosse. um, and I guess like he's a pretty big deal. He is junior class president, and he's supposed to be like the big man on campus. Even though he is, by stature, he's small, right? Which is always the gist. But they don't ever really crack into that the way like they do in the sitcom. Like, Will always cracked on Carlton for being short, but it's not a thing so far in this new show. So I don't know why they actually got someone like shorter. It didn't seem like, but I guess like for visual, like you just, Carlton is short, like that's like what people associate with. So they just got someone who's not as tall as Jabari Banks, who plays Will Smith. Um, so, but like his character is a lot more interesting now, because in the old one he was the the black kid who grew up in a rich neighborhood next to a bunch of rich white people, and that was his shtick, right? Like, he was like, he was portrayed to be someone that's not, that never grew up in that urban setting, in the projects like Will did, but instead he grew up extremely privileged. So they paint him as like more white than black, right? And I think the new Carlton definitely does a pretty good job of doing that, per in a way, but like not so much more white than black, but just way more privileged. Like the amount of things that um his motivations are clearly, is always just to get ahead in life. With old Carlton, he did the same thing, but in this way they paint it in a way where he's just willing to do anything to get his way. He's extremely jealous, especially when Will comes around, because now he's like, oh, I was the only boy. Now there's two boys, and now I'm pissed because like the attention is no longer on me. So they dive into a lot of those negative feelings a lot more in depth than they do in the sitcom, which is like, makes sense. And arguably in a lot of ways, like, this new Carlton is like almost like a little evil, but you want to feel sad. You want to feel for him and be like, oh well, you know what, like he doesn't. He's naive, but he's also like almost like it paints him to be like the like just like a new antagonist, the anti-Will, whereas like old Carlton was, yeah, he was naive and like kind of goofy, but like you still liked him as a character because he was just kind of fun loving, whereas this new Carlton is just like, dude, this guy's a dick. Like new Carlton is a punk. um and I'm curious to how the series will kind of move forward and showcase him in terms of being what type of person that he'll be. Because already it's like it's not painting him in a good way. He's also like a drug user, ooh, and so which is not. I mean, it's a lot more gritty. It's a lot darker. The only character that they don't really go into a lot at all, I would say, is Ashley. Ashley, like she has maybe in 3 episodes 5 minutes worth of screen time, says like 4 lines, and that's it. So maybe they'll grow into her a little bit more later, but so far nothing really comes to mind. Um, Jeffrey is different. So now instead of a British butler, he is the Jamaican house manager, whatever that is. So I'm guessing, and he has a much more closer relationship with Uncle Phil. Obviously, in the sitcom, Jeffrey was like also a comedic addition who constantly ridiculed Uncle Phil for his weight. The best joke that I ever that I feel like he always pulls off was when Uncle Phil was about to build a new crib, and he's like, and Uncle Phil goes, "Oh, Jeffrey, fetch my tools," and he's like, "Your knife and fork." It was just like it was hilarious, like he always like makes um those just fat cracks. But obviously the new Uncle Phil is not fat in this one. So but so Jeffrey is more now of a confidant, like a best friend to Uncle Phil, instead of the joking butler, who waits on the house. And lastly, Uncle Phil, I can't help but think of James Avery. Rest in peace, my man. And he, like, James Avery was just awesome, as Uncle Phil. He was funny. He was charismatic. He was suave in some cases, and he was just such a great, great, great actor because he was the seasoned Shakespearean actor too. So he was amazing, and so the new Uncle Phil, very interesting. More like, the one thing they do play on that's the same is that, like, okay, you know Philip Banks grew up in North Carolina, Yamacraw, and grew up extremely poor with nothing, and grew up to be a successful lawyer. And they do play off that as well here. Um, but you can kind of tell, or like, but I guess one thing that's a little different, significantly different, is that since the time frame is a 20, almost 20 years, like, later into the future, or what, or into today, old Uncle Phil and old Aunt Viv, right, like they were alive. They were young and alive during the civil rights movement. So a lot of their backstory deals with, how Will is all about, Black history and Black empowerment. But you have Uncle Phil and Aunt Viv, who's like, dude, I lived through all the stuff that you learn about in school. One of the first things that they talk about in the first episode is how Uncle Phil said, like, oh, you have that Malcolm X on your wall and you read his book, but I heard him speak. It's like that's a whole like different type of story, right? Like that's his, kind of street cred, so to say. Whereas new Uncle Banks is like, okay, well, he is no longer technically a boomer, like the way he's supposed to be. In the old one, he is arguably more of like a Gen Xer, a person who grew up after the civil rights movement happened. Not that he didn't, and like he did. So basically, what I'm trying to say, he doesn't have necessarily the same kind of street cred old Uncle Phil had. Yeah, he grew up poor and he grew up in probably a very racist area. I mean, I have no idea Yamakawa is real, but North Carolina isn't exactly known to be super accepting. From what I understand, which I could be wrong. I don't know. But the idea is that like he grew up kind of like Will did, but he's come into a life that's very very wealthy and surrounds himself in a way that's like not your stereotypical depiction of like how black people live in this country. So I guess like for him is like I would want to see how they throw back, give him more street cred, so to say. Give him, because I think one thing that Will gives Uncle Phil a little bit more credit later is the fact that, oh yeah, he lived all the things, like he built a lot of the foundation that a lot of the opportunities that Will and his children, or what, not Will and his children, Will and Uncle Phil's children get to afford now, right? And they've yet to really focus in on that. So that's kind of like the character breakdown so far. Story wise, they're throwing in a lot more people in terms of the story, like Lisa, who they're immediately throwing in here. If you're not familiar, Lisa was a love interest of Will's, but she wasn't introduced, I think, until like season 5 in the sitcom. So, but they throwing in her in almost immediately, and her dynamic, or her character dynamic, is a lot more interesting because instead of just someone that Will dates, is now she's someone that Carlton used to date, and now Will is kind of encroaching in on that. So there's a little bit more of a love triangle going on there. I don't know if I like it as much, but we'll see. Like, maybe it's something completely new. But again, I can't help but keep comparing past and present, So I'm hoping that eventually the story does break out into its own, and like they stop following, because the first 3 episodes are literally like, I wouldn't say copy and paste from the old sitcom, but it's pretty familiar. It's kind of like the difference between Genroso's chicken and sweet and sour chicken. It's like, hey, there's some similarities in terms of it being a tangy, sweet type of dish, but one's spicy and one's not. Like that's the best way I can actually really describe it, in terms of how there's similarities. So we'll see what happens. Overall, I think Rotten Tomatoes gave this show a 65% or something like that so far. So we'll see what it happens next few episodes. I think the general audience reception is okay with it, but we shall see what happens. Actually, we can just look it up now. Like, what am I doing? So, Rotten Tomato. Let's go to nope. TV shows. Yeah, critics gave it a 65. Audience score 86. That is interesting. A 21-point difference. So looks like audiences are, those who reviewed it, have 21 user ratings, are liking it. So it's not bad. So that's not bad at all. So if you have a chance, if you haven't seen Bel-Air, I'd actually suggest to watch it, because like it's not, I mean, I actually enjoyed the first 3 episodes, and we'll see if it really starts playing out to be pretty good. Oh, sorry, one more character I guess like I want to also just talk about is Jazz. I can't help but compare this Jazz to old Jazz, DJ Jazzy Jeff. um but he's definitely not the same. I mean, we'll see if they throw in the whole, how much Jazz is in love with Hillary bit. But the new Jazz, he is a DJ, or at least like a music producer of types. But so far he shows up only a few times, so we'll see how much he plays. I do wish that they did a little bit of fan service where, when they greeted each other or at least like about to say bye. I do wish they did the whole like I wish they did that or at least alluded to some of it, but it wasn't in the show. Maybe they'll throw it in later as a kind of a, like I said, like more fan service. But I mean, it'll be silly, but come on, like just a little bit. But yeah. So overall, I think this is worth at least a watch if you have the time. I wouldn't say it's like the best show, but it's only been 3 episodes. We'll see how they build into the story and if they're gonna really break out from the old sitcom later. Because I think that's the thing is like they really need to break out from it. So that's my take on Bel Air, the new reimagination of Fresh Prince of Bel Air. Let me know what you guys think of this show in the comments. Leave a like, subscribe, do all that stuff, and we shall talk later. All right. Take it easy, folks.